Last 24 hours have witnessed a certain reduction in fighting on the Ukrainian battlefronts. One can see this from the Russian Defense Ministry's figures. Over the last couple of days, actually quite a large number of days, since basically the beginning of February, the Russian Defense Ministry has been claiming that Ukraine has suffered losses of around 1,000 men, dead and wounded, across the Ukrainian battlefronts per day. And as I've discussed previously, that did not appear to include the Avdeyevka battle area, where which until the fall of the town, the Russian Defense Ministry did not discuss at all. No bulletins were provided about it by the Russian Defense Ministry. Well, over the last 24 hours, the total of losses that the Russian Defense Ministry claims Ukraine has suffered has fallen to 915. Now that still sounds extremely high, but it's important to say that well above half of this number is accounted by the 565 Ukrainian troops which the Russian military claims were killed or wounded in the Avdeyevka area in the 24 hours before the bulletin was published. So that perhaps gives us a sense of the sheer scale of the fighting in Avdeyevka, the way it eclipses the fighting in every other place, but it also shows that fighting across the front lines has actually reduced and reduced substantially. And if we go to the actual numbers for the various battle areas, we can see this. So in the Kupiansk area, the Russian Defense Ministry says that 30 servicemen were killed. There have been days when the numbers have been well into the hundreds. There in the moreover, as has been pointed out by many people, the Kupiansk area has now been enlarged. It has been merged with the Liman area. So 30 enemy losses, Ukrainian losses, in the Kupiansk area extend to both Kupiansk and Liman. And as I said, in the past, 500 men killed and wounded have been attributed by the Russians to the Ukrainians in these two areas, and now it's down to just 30. If we go further, the Russians are now openly combining losses, the area of Bakhmut with that of Marinka. They're now being lumped together. Ukrainian losses in these two areas taken together now, over the last 24 hours, the Russians claim that they were 275. Again, this is a marked reduction from the much higher numbers we used to see. 275 used to be about an average day in the Bakhmut area. And further south, if we go to the Zaporozhye area, there the Russians say that the Ukrainians lost 150 men, and that, by the way, includes the Vremivka salient area as well, and in the Kherson area, which now also apparently includes parts of Zaporozhye, well, Ukrainian losses there were down to 45 men. So a very significant fall in totals of Ukrainian losses, except, of course, importantly, in the Avdeyevka area, where fighting continues to be very intense, though it seems for the moment to be confined to the immediate area of Avdeyevka itself. There have been many reports from Russian reporters, even some Russian military people, saying that there are still large numbers of Ukrainian troops hiding in Avdeyevka. They're having to be rounded up. In some cases, they still put up resistance, and there are firefights. There are probably also Ukrainian soldiers in the fields around Avdeyevka trying still to escape, though the conditions these soldiers must be facing, if they really are there in the open fields in winter, well, one can't even begin to describe them. But anyway, heavy Ukrainian losses in Avdeyevka over the last 24 hours, apparently including whatever fight there was carried out by the Russians, conducted by the Russians, to capture the coke factory. Russian officials say that there may still be Ukrainian soldiers hiding in the basement and bunker areas and tunnels behind the coke factory. So they have to be hunted down and searched out. I recall that it took several weeks before the Russians were able to confirm that all Ukrainian troops hiding under the Azovstal factory had indeed been hunted down and either taken prisoner or killed. This was after the Ukrainian surrender in the Azovstal factory. And it's likely something similar is going on in Avdeyevka itself. And it seems that the Russians are also transferring large numbers of engineering troops to Avdeyevka, to carrying out demining operations, to clean the town of booby traps and explosives. And of course, these engineering troops themselves need to be protected. So there is a large operation still underway in Avdeyevka, but elsewhere on the front lines, things have been somewhat quieter. Somewhat quieter, except of course we do get reports still of fighting in Rabotino and in the area of the Bradley Square, and also in Marinka, which I will turn to shortly. Now let's turn firstly to the fighting around Rabotino. There is still fighting going on around Rabotino. There are lots of conflicting reports about what is going on around that village. Yesterday, Riba was saying that the Russians had broken through and were fighting in the center of Rabotino. And now there are reports that they've been pushed back. I would point out, point made many times in the past during the fighting in the summer, Rabotino is a small place. So talking about reaching its outskirts, fighting over it, the area itself might be, well, fairly large, but the number of buildings is not. So anyway, fighting apparently continues around there. But the most important news about Rabotino, which touches on a point that I made yesterday, is that it seems that the Ukrainians are rushing reinforcements to Rabotino. There's been reports that up to 30 armoured vehicles have been sent by Ukraine to the area. A Ukrainian soldier has been captured in the area, and he comes from a Ukrainian brigade, which was part of Ukraine's strategic reserve. So Ukraine is now committing part of its strategic reserve to the fight for Rabotino. I suspect that if the Russians have stepped back, it is because, yet again, they see that the Ukrainians are falling into the trap being conducting the war in the way that the Russians want, by committing troops to undefendable positions, allowing the Russians to conduct aggressive attrition against them, grinding down Ukrainian reserves. The Russians don't have to advance in order to do that, because whenever there is the slightest hint that the Russians might capture some territory, an isolated village like Rabotino, for example, or whatever, the Ukrainians help the Russians by transferring large numbers of troops to try to defend it straight into the teeth of the Russian war machine, which is then able to ground them down. And again, I come back to the point I made in my program yesterday. Why is Ukraine even defending this area? They captured it at prodigious cost in the summer, the whole of Bradley Square. They were not able to exploit their victory, which wasn't, of course, a victory, it was actually a defeat, their so-called victory in carving up the salient in Bradley Square. They're now surrounded on three sides by the Russians. The Russians are pushing westward from Verbovoye, eastward from Kopani, further north of Rabotino. They're attacking in the Rabotino area itself. They have massive artillery and missile superiority. They have clear-cut air superiority. So what is the value of this ground, which Ukraine did not control just a few months ago? What is the value of this ground to Ukraine? Why are they still trying to cling on to it? It's not as if anybody realistically expects that Ukraine in its present condition is going to be able to relaunch its offensive at any point soon in this area. Isn't it just a case of throwing more good men into a battle where more of them are killed and lost to no discernible or useful military purpose? I can't help but think that the probable reason why the Ukrainians are fighting for Rabotino and committing reserve brigades to its defense is because a few weeks ago, President Zelensky supposedly visited Rabotino himself, spoke with some of the soldiers there. There was a film. Many people questioned whether he was actually even there. But anyway, the fact is that he supposedly visited Rabotino, and therefore he sees once more his prestige invested in the defense of this village, which, to my understanding, the Ukrainians have never gained full control of. It has always been contested. It's been too close to the Russian lines to be really useful to the Ukrainians as a staging post, for example. So he has, but nonetheless, in spite of the fact that the film of this village shows a completely shattered landscape, buildings, these wooden izbas, as village houses in this part of the world are called, absolutely smashed up and ground to pieces. Hardly a tree left standing as far as I can see. Anyway, despite all of that, it must apparently be held. That is the political or media imperative. So for that reason, this place must be held, because of course if Ukraine loses control of Bradley Square, if it's pushed back, if this salient, the territory of this salient is recaptured by the Russians, if the Russians are able to press on towards Orechov, for example, well, that would mean that the Ukrainian offensive of the summer had not only failed, but would have been seen to have failed. So, for that reason, and that reason only, men have to be sent and sacrificed in this place. I have to say, it's bizarre to me. It all comes back to this issue that I've discussed in many places, the refusal to admit to the fact that the defeat of Ukraine's summer offensive was a defeat, the pretense that it was only a failure, and therefore the inability to make realistic decisions based on the recognition of that fact. Now, saying all of this, I don't know what the Russians actually intend to do in this area. They do seem to be quietly gathering up the pieces here, regaining ground. Vladimir Saldo is now the Russian governor of Zaporozhye region. Vladimir Rogov, one of his deputies, they're all telling us that gradually the Russians are working to recover all the ground that they ceded during the offensive, and that they're making progress in order to achieve that, which is very likely true. But it seems that whatever it is that the Russians planned, the Ukrainians have decided to make a fight of it. And as I said, from a Russian point of view, that plays in to their larger plans, their bigger plans, the plan of aggressive attrition, which I've discussed. Elsewhere on the battlefronts, there is considerable news from the Marinka area, though it's not entirely easy to decipher. There's been a lot of fighting around the village of Pobeda and the village of Novomikhailivka. It does look as if the Russians are in the process of capturing these two villages. Might take some time. We'll have to wait and see. But at least there does seem to be more progress there by the Russians. And there were lots of reports last night, that the Russians have entered Pobeda itself and that they're in the process of capturing this village. Now, as I said, some evidence, therefore, of a Russian pause. They are catching breath after the attack on Avdeyevka. There's been, as Dima at the Military Summary Channel has pointed out, a very substantial reorganization by the Russians of the names they use for the various parts of the front line. That means so Kupiansk and Liman have been combined into a single direction, as the Russians call it. Bakhmut and Marinka, the same. That's a single direction as well. Kherson and Zaporozhye have also been combined into a single direction. And Avdeyevka, which lies midway between the two parts of the new Bakhmut-Marinka direction, is now treated as a direction of its own. Now, some people, Dima, are seeing a great deal into this, reading a great deal into this. It might suggest a major reorganization of commanders, and it could perhaps reflect the very big increases in the Russian military, the Russian forces that are now operating on the contact line, so that it makes more sense, given that the forces are much larger in size, much bigger in size, to expand their theatres of operation to reflect that fact. Or it could just be a product of the fact that, as I said, for the moment at least, there's less fighting to talk about, and most of the fighting is Avdeyevka, and having failed to speak about Avdeyevka for many weeks, you want to focus on the intense fighting that is taking place there. Regardless, as I've said in previous programs, after the Battle of Avdeyevka, the collapse of which I suspect, the speed of the collapse of which I suspect surprise even the Russians. It will almost certainly be the case that the Russians will resume their westward offensive fairly soon. All the rhetoric from Russian officials suggests that, and certainly it looks as if that will probably be the case in the Avdeyevka area specifically. Now, while just wrapping up on Avdeyevka, yesterday I said, after reciting the various military units that Putin had identified and congratulated for their work in liberating Avdeyevka, that I said that it didn't seem to me that the Rosgvardia organization and the Wagner forces had been included in that list, but it turns out that they were in fact included, and that the reference to the Wagner organization, the ex-Wagner fighters, which has been made, specifically, well, there's a specific reference to in the President Putin's comments congratulating the Russian soldiers to something which is called the Volunteers Veterans Unit, and that apparently is the ex-Wagner fighters. Now, they have in fact been speaking about the battle. They've been speaking about the Battle of Avdeyevka, and they've been saying that it was a much easier battle than the Battle of Bakhmut that they were involved in before. And they commented about how the fighting was less intense, how the soldiers that they were fighting against were less motivated and less strong, and that altogether the impression is that they think that the Battle of Bakhmut was a much more straightforward battle. I'm going to briefly read the report which has been provided by Slavyangrad, but it is from the Russian journalist Sasha Kots, and he says, I met some fighters from the volunteer corps of the Ministry of Defense who had been through the Bakhmut meat grinder from start to finish. Naturally, I asked what was harder. This is from Sasha Kots, who, as I said, is a Russian military journalist. And they respond, Artyomovsk, that of course is the Russian name for Bakhmut, was hell. It was the first contact for us. Here we are already experienced. It is much easier. We know how to clear buildings, how to storm, where they can be, where they can't be. The elderly here were crying, very happy about the Russian troops. They had been waiting for us for 10 years. They say they were mocked here. Well, we're not leaving here. And then Sasha Kots asked, what do you think of the enemy compared to Artyomovsk? And the reply comes, they lack spirit, they're afraid. There were Georgians and Poles there, worthy opponents. Here they're retreating, and some surrender immediately. Perhaps the reason is that Kiev threw freshly mobilized people to Avdeyevka without normal training, outfit, and equipment. By the way, that does not seem to be the case. As far as I can tell, the Ukrainian military units in Avdeyevka were, in fact, some of the best in the Ukrainian army. It could just be that even the quality of these units is deteriorating. The unwillingness, for example, of the 3rd Assault Brigade, the former Azov Brigade, to obey orders and fight in Avdeyevka might suggest that. Anyway, to continue, when the collapse of control occurred, this is again the ex-Wagner fighters, the Ukrainian military was disorganized. They left, abandoning arsenals and their own wounded. The Pyatnashka was even contacted by Ukrainian commanders who gave points and asked them not to bomb it. What that refers to is that some Ukrainian units, some Ukrainian groups of soldiers who were cut off and surrounded officers of the Ukrainian army actually contacted the Russian command and identified where those Ukrainian soldiers were and said, don't bomb them, they're prepared to surrender. And the Wagner fighters ex-Wagner fighters go on to say, they said that their 300s, that's to say these wounded, were there, please take them away, and ours took them away and evacuated them to a safe zone. This is to the question of the allegedly shot prisoners. There is a claim by Ukraine that the Russians have been shooting prisoners captured in Avdeyevka. It's one of those claims that is often made in wars. I don't believe it is true, and the Russians are careful to deny it. And these Wagner fighters are denying it as well. So it's clear that the Veterans Volunteer Brigade of the Russian Ministry of Defense is ex-Wagner fighters, and I am going to suggest that their experience of fighting in places like Popasnaya and Mariupol, and above all Bakhmut, was invaluable in the fighting in Avdeyevka. As they say themselves, we are already experienced. It is much easier. We know how to clear buildings, how to storm, where they can be, where they can't be. So the Russians have that accumulated experience now of how to conduct street fighting, with the result that losses over the course of street fighting are much less heavy than they were at earlier stages in the war. So that's what I wanted to say about the role of the ex-Wagner fighters. Well, we are going to have to wait and see what the Russians are going to do next over the course of the next few days. I understand that some Russian military officials are now saying that if things continue on their current course, then they expect that the war will end sometime in September, that by that point, Ukraine's combat potential, the remaining combat potential of the Ukrainian forces will have become completely exhausted. Now, I have to say straight away, I've seen several reports claiming that Russian officers are saying this. I have not myself seen these actual comments by these Russian officers at first hand. I've no reason to doubt that this is indeed being said, but I haven't seen it myself, and I don't know how senior the officers who are allegedly saying this actually are. I have not so far seen any reports to this effect on the Russian Defense Ministry's Telegram channel or its website. Anyway, that's one thing. Now, one other person has been busy over the last 24 hours, and that is President Zelensky. He has been doing what he likes to do, which is tour the battlefronts. He's been to Kupiansk, and he's apparently likely to go to other places. Supposedly, he intends to visit all of the various major positions on the remaining front lines. It's unclear what the purpose of this is. Putin does not do this. And I have said in the past that visiting the front lines can be generally inspiring for frontline soldiers and does show a certain courage on Zelensky's part. But after a certain point, it starts to pall. Ultimately, commanders, supreme commanders especially, need to be at their headquarters where they have to make the kind of decisions that only they can make in order to conduct a war. And I can't help but think that the primary reason why Zelensky, having returned from Germany to Kiev, has again immediately left Kiev to visit the soldiers on the front lines, is because he doesn't want to be in Kiev. And it's not difficult to understand why. The political situation in Kiev is extremely difficult for him and becoming more difficult all the time. Alex Christoforou and I did a program about this yesterday. You can find it on the Duran. We discussed the various permutations of the political crisis in Kiev in detail. We explained who the various actors are, and we debated the sort of scenarios that might play out. It's important to say President Zelensky still has some cards to play. Western governments still appear to back him, or at least European governments do. And he still has the support, or at least the loyalty, of the internal security services, the SBU and Kirill Budanov's military intelligence agency. So he's not without some props that maintain his position. But none of that changes the fact that he's coming in for increasing criticism in Kiev itself. His popularity is collapsing, and his support is starting to look brittle. Also, of course, he has to contend with the fact that his constitutional term as president of Ukraine apparently ends in May, and he will remain president of Ukraine, or so he intends, because of martial law. There is martial law in Ukraine, but I understand that the constitutional propriety of that is being challenged in Ukraine itself. And of course, with the decline of his popularity and with the defeats on the battlefronts, the challenges to him and to the propriety of his remaining president of Ukraine are certain to grow. So, he doesn't want to be in Kiev. He doesn't want to face his opponents. He's probably uncomfortable being in Kiev. So he goes to Munich, he goes to Berlin, he comes back to Kiev, and then he immediately leaves Kiev and goes to the front lines, where I suspect by now the soldiers have become increasingly cynical about his visit. There is one photograph I've seen of Zelensky in Kupiansk. He looks exhausted and, well, I have to say haunted. He has what looks to me like a haunted look. Many commented upon his despondency when he was at the Munich Security Conference. And, well, he looks an even sadder man in this photograph that I have seen of him. Now, in some respects, it is not surprising, because the important thing to say is that he returned to Kiev from the Munich Security Conference empty-handed. There are a lot of words about the West's support for Ukraine, but there's been very little of substance. We've had words about the European Union providing Ukraine with 1 million drones. Zelensky has heard all of these claims about weapons being supplied in the million by the West before, by the Europeans especially before, and it has not materialized. He wants more artillery and more ammunition, but there is none to give him. There's a huge row underway, apparently, between the European Union, within the European Union, over the artillery and ammunition question. Bitter recriminations between European governments. The French are being blamed for the fact that they insist that any funding on weapon systems, including ammunition, to be sent to Ukraine must be used to buy these weapon systems and this ammunition. In Ukraine itself, in the European Union itself, other countries are not unhappy with this. They understand that the ability to buy weapons and ammunition within the European Union is exhausted, but probably the French and some other governments understand that if they're going to start to buy weapons from third parties, realistically, the only third party that they can buy them from in any quantity is the United States, and they're becoming conscious that the European public, or at least part of the European public, or at least the European public in some countries, is now becoming increasingly jaded by the fact that the United States appears to be reaping all the benefits, such as they are, from this war, and that Europe is carrying all the burdens. So there's been arguments, quarrels about this, but as far as Zelensky is concerned, the sum total of it is that there is no more actual equipment, military equipment, being supplied at the moment from Europe to Ukraine. Some German politicians are now trying to revive the idea of supplying Taurus missiles to Ukraine, citing the death of Alexei Navalny as a reason to do it. Apparently this is supposed to be some means of pressuring the Russians. That seems to me an odd thing to do, if I have to be honest. But anyway, there is that. And in the United States, there are murmurs that the United States, that the administration is now starting to reconsider its decision not to supply the longer range ATACMS missiles. But of course, they will only be able to do that, or so they say, if Congress passes its authorization bill, $61 billion authorization bill, and Speaker Johnson says he's not prepared to put it to the House of Representatives, and the House of Representatives is now on leave and won't reconvene for at least a further week. So at the moment, there is standstill there. So Zelensky came back to Kiev with nothing of substance to show at all. No new weapons. In fact, the only definite report about weapons is that the delivery of the F-16s has now been again postponed to June. And the reason that's been given, and it's been provided by Yuri Igna, the spokesman of Ukraine's Air Defense Command, he says that Ukraine has to completely refurbish its infrastructure, its bases to be able to operate the F-16s. This is proving very difficult to do, and that is the reason for the postponement and delivery of these aircraft. And of course that makes it, the whole question of delivering these aircraft, questionable at all, because the Russians of course are aware of this, and that will make attacks on the air bases, on the runways, by the Russian missiles. Well, that will make it even more likely to happen, and that by itself is likely to disrupt the operation of the F-16s. Now, I understand that the total number of pilots who have been trained to fly these aircraft at the moment is 20. I believe that 8 have completed their training, or at least have reached a certain level of training. 12 are being trained beyond that. This does not look like an impressive force, to put it mildly. And in the meantime, weapons that have been supplied to Ukraine before by the West continue to be destroyed. The Leopard 2s have now been spread out all over the battlefronts. Ukraine is keeping its Challenger 2s and its Abrams tanks and its Leopard 1s in the rear, but the Leopard 2s continue to operate on the battlefronts, and over the last 2 days, the Russians have destroyed 2 of them in very, very different locations. In the Marinka area, in one case, in another part of Donbass, I understand, in another. So it looks as if these tanks have been spread out in penny packets. They operate in isolated small numbers by themselves, often just one tank at a time, and the Russians have been able to pick them off. And the Russians continue, by their account, to destroy air defense systems. They claim that they destroyed another SAMP-T French missile battery just yesterday. They also have recently, fairly recently, provided what looked like conclusive daylight photographs of a destroyed HIMARS missile launcher. There's lots of disputes about how many HIMARS missile launchers the Russians have actually destroyed. I suspect they've destroyed several, but that the United States has been replacing them. But of course, who knows? But anyway, some of these have been destroyed, and almost every day we get reports that more M777s, these howitzers, have been destroyed as well. And there are lots of reports that the condition of the barrels, the gun barrels of many of these Western artillery pieces has now deteriorated to the point where they're no longer especially accurate or effective. Whatever range advantage Western artillery purportedly gave the Ukrainians at an earlier stage of the war has now conclusively gone. Again, Simplicus the thinker has recently done a further discussion on this rather interesting point. So Zelensky, looking dejected, demoralized. It's difficult to imagine that this exhausted and demoralized man can be injecting much confidence in the Ukrainian soldiers that he meets. And it is important to stress again that the big hammer blow from the Russians has still not come. There are reports that the Russians have increased the size of their army by a further 50,000 men. Another 50,000 men have joined the Russian military since the start of this year. And the Russian military industries continue to hum and produce weapons at a staggering rate. Now, there's been a rather interesting article. I say interesting, in some ways it's telling me nothing that I didn't know, but it is interesting because of where it has appeared, which is in the Daily Telegraph. There's been a rather interesting article in the Daily Telegraph about the Russian economy. It says how the Russian economy allowed Putin to silence Navalny forever, which is a weird way of putting it. But the article then goes on to say Western sanctions have failed to cripple the Kremlin's war effort. Now, I'm not going to read the article in any detail because it says literally nothing that I haven't discussed at length on many previous occasions. But it is an admission that the Russian economy has been barely dented. In fact, not only has it not been dented, its growth rate over the last 2 years, its underlying growth rate, appears to have improved. And there's a comment, I just mentioned this, a comment from a Russian expat who lives in the UK called Elena. She apparently recently made a trip back to her childhood home in Tatarstan. And she says, I thought there would be a greater police presence in the streets and billboards with propaganda. There was none of that at all. You kind of forget that the war is happening. It was very surreal to feel like everything is fine. And then others are quoted as saying, this is a person called Olga, another Russian expat living in the UK. It was shockingly normal. The vibe in restaurants and cafes was just so buzzing. One night we were trying to get a booking at some restaurant and we couldn't. It was completely booked up. People are out and life is going on. And Elena, going back to her, she does say that everything is surreal, but she goes on to say that the coffee is terrible. Everybody is complaining that they can't find decent coffee anywhere. Well, that may be true. I don't know. I'm not drinking coffee in Russia at the moment. But there's complaints that groceries are more expensive. But overall, the general admission is that the situation in the Russian economy is stable. And we read that 2 years after soldiers marched into Ukraine and missiles started raining over Kiev, the reality of Russia today is a far cry from apocalyptic predictions about what would happen to its economy, despite a barrage of Western sanctions, such as blocking the country from the SWIFT payment system, messaging system, seizing assets and capping oil exports. Putin is presiding over a growing economy. Last year, Russia's economy grew by 3.6% after shrinking only 1.2% in 2022. According to Rostat, the IMF has predicted that predicted in April 2022 that the economy would contract by 8.5% in 2022 and 2.3% in 2023. Well, as we see, what we've got instead is growth. The IMF now says that Russia's economy will grow by 2.6% this year, which is more than the UK, France and Germany. And by the way, I believe the United States also, though American figures are always difficult, at least for me, to completely understand. And the article then goes off into a long discussion about Navalny. There are predictions that the sanctions will in time catch up with the economy and that things will eventually turn south. But Richard Connolly, who is an expert at RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute in London, he is not so sure. He says that optimism about how hard sanctions would bite shows a lack of understanding in the West and a failure to learn from what happened in 2014 during the annexation of Crimea. I think it was arrogance. I think it was ineptitude. A lot of people say it doesn't count because it's military spending, but you have to pay people to work in factories. You have to pay for all the inputs. Whilst it's true that you're producing goods that are going to end up exploding, and you'd say there's no ultimate benefit from that, there is a benefit for the people who are paid to produce them, as a result, we've seen real incomes rise for the first time in years. And he goes on, there's further discussions about how Russia has been able to obtain and develop new trading links. And he then says that Russia has found new partners in countries like China, India, and Turkey, and returning to the topic of slow collapse. As I said, Connolly is not convinced. He said many observers argue that the absence of economic collapse in Russia reflects the slow burn nature of sanctions, with pain being stored up for the future. Connolly is less convinced. This is Telegraph saying it. He believes Russia is adapting, and so sanctions may become less effective over time. They have reoriented their trade flows dramatically. Even during the Cold War, Russia's biggest trade partner was Western Europe, and now it's non-Western countries. There has never been a shift like this in Russian economic history. I don't mean since 1991, I mean since 1500. Well, that sounds very much like the sort of things people like me, and by the way, Glenn Deason, about the last, have been saying. It's nice to see that, 2 years late, some people are coming round to our point of view. But anyway, there we go. There are problems in the Russian economy. They are right, the Daily Telegraph is right to talk about the fact that there are labour shortages, which will probably continue and will increase. But I ought to say that there are obvious solutions to labour shortages. And the obvious one, which I am sure the Russian authorities will eventually come to, if they haven't already, and they probably have come to it already, is simply to import more workers. Now, you don't need to give these workers citizenship, but you can bring them in from countries where there is large, high unemployment, especially youth unemployment, where people, however, are educated and skilled, at least to a certain level, and where they can fulfill basic tasks, freeing your own workers to actually do the sort of things that only the better trained workers can do. And what I'm talking about here is guest workers, which is different from immigration. Immigration is when people come in and obtain citizenship. Guest workers retain their own citizenship. Usually they send remittances back to their families, which can actually help the economies of their home countries. And there are countries around Russia which are ideally positioned to do all of this. Iran, for example, which has a high unemployment, youth unemployment problem. The Central Asian republics, a natural, an obvious source of guest workers. Guest workers from Central Asia have been working in Russia for a very long time. And I've discussed in earlier programs how North Korean workers play a role as well. And I am sure that a combination of this, work to automate and update production facilities, and also policies to try to increase the birth rate, and of course the rise in real incomes will probably facilitate that over time. I'm sure that that will mean that this labour problem can be overcome, with the need for guest workers perhaps reducing, more guest workers perhaps reducing over time. Anyway, there's one point in this article which completely baffles me, And this is a claim that with spending in Russia being diverted into military production, well, I'll read the comment. A looming problem for Russia is how cash feeding the war machine is diverting resources away from innovation and improving productivity. And they speak about issues such as high inflation, unfavorable demographics. Well, inflation, as I said, is falling, and I've discussed how one can deal with the issue of demographics, and a lack of investment will constrain future growth. What is the evidence for a fall or a lack of investment? Russia's central bank chair, Elvira Nabiullina, actually spoke the other day about an investment surge. I discussed it in a recent video. So, does the Daily Telegraph know something which Russia's own central bank chair doesn't? That is an absurd proposition. And in fact, the reality is that we are seeing an investment surge right across the economy, and it is what is driving growth forward. Anyway, and what Nabiullina said is likely to increase the economy's growth potential further also going forward. Anyway, there we are. This is an article in the Daily Telegraph. I think it was about a year ago, or a bit earlier than that they were publishing articles by an academic from Yale telling us that it was all smoke and mirrors, that there was no actual Russian growth going on. We've had claims, also reported in the Daily Telegraph, based on research supposedly done by the Finnish central bank, that the economy, apart from military production, is stagnant. Well, we see that this simply isn't true. And buried in the article, there is the admission that the statistics that are being provided by Rosstat, Russia's statistical agency, there is no reason to doubt that they are actually true. So, there is not going to be an economic collapse in Russia. There's not going to be a demographic collapse in Russia. The Russians can sustain this war indefinitely. Their losses have probably fallen proportionately, and their production of weapon systems is growing. And still, neither Zelensky nor the West is prepared to talk peace. There are lots of articles explaining why seeking peace with Russia would be wrong. There was a long article in the London Review of Books by a journalist, a veteran journalist, called James Meek. None of them seem to me to be at all connected to reality. What these people don't seem to understand is that the longer negotiations are delayed, postponed, the more likely that it will be that the defeat, when it comes in Ukraine, and the Russian victory will be more total. Anyway, that's the situation for the moment in Ukraine. There are some other matters I want to wrap up with in this program. The first is, of course, that the High Court in London is now looking at considering in a 2-day hearing Julian Assange's application for permission to appeal the various orders made by Judge Baritza at the Westminster Magistrates Court, which said that he is legally eligible for extradition to the United States. I hope for the best, but based on what has happened in the past, I am not confident that this appeal will be successful. Anyway, we shall see. There has been, I should say that I have now read not the full judgment, but the executive summary of the decision, the recent decision of the International Court of Justice rejecting Ukraine's application to have Russia declared a terrorist state. Now, I've heard descriptions of this judgment. Some people have said that it was an excoriating judgment. It was a judgment very critical in places of the way in which Ukraine has brought the case, of the way in which Ukraine has consistently failed to substantiate its claims. I have to say, overall, I found this judgment and related orders and judgments in claims that Ukraine has brought against Russia to be a comprehensive victory for the Russians, but not exactly a excoriating judgment. It uses the judgment is carefully drafted, carefully expressed, in measured language, and it engages in very substantive and careful legal analysis indeed. The Russians have gained a significant legal victory. Meanwhile, even as they've gained this big victory in the court, in the International Court of Justice, another court, a Dutch court in The Hague, has now rejected their appeal against what I think was a bizarre arbitration order in the Hodorkovsky case, the UKOS case, awarding UKOS shareholders 50 billion euros, one which cut completely against earlier decisions of the European Court of Human Rights, which the arbitration panel completely disregarded. Well, I don't know how enforceable this new decision by the Dutch court will be. I have to say that in the present climate, I would have expected no other outcome. It might conceivably be used to try to justify seizure of some Russian sovereign assets, but I think that is most unlikely to be legally doable or to provide legal justification for doing it. Thirdly, I have now been reading what look to be fairly substantiated reports that on the eve of Alexei Navalny's death, there were actual negotiations underway between the Russians, the Germans, and the Americans to exchange Navalny for various people whom the Russians wanted returned to Russia and who are held in Western prisons. And this particular reference is to an individual named Krasikov, who appears to have been some kind of agent of the Russian state, perhaps at least. Anyway, he's been convicted of an assassination. In fact, he undoubtedly did carry out an assassination in Germany. The Russians want him back. Anyway, there was a complex negotiation involving this person, and one of the people who was being sought in return for Krasikov was Navalny. Now, that makes it surely less likely that Navalny was, in that case, murdered by Putin. I say this, or murdered on President Putin's orders, or murdered on the orders of the Russian state. I mean, it doesn't definitely disprove it, but what would be the logic of negotiating the release of one of your people in return for the exchange of Navalny, and then killing Navalny. I mean, it doesn't follow any logic to me. No doubt you could come up with scenarios that would explain it, but I don't really see what those scenarios are, and I suspect that any of them would be, frankly, unsubstantiated and far-fetched. Now, I said up to this point that I'm not going to discuss the circumstances of Navalny's death. We've not yet had an autopsy report or a result from the existing investigation. Appreciate that many people are skeptical about the results of that autopsy and of that investigation. I have always found that even when results of investigations and autopsies are manipulated, it's usually possible to work out that they have been manipulated, and that can usually give you some clues as to what really happened. So I am going to wait before giving my final conclusions until we see what the results of this autopsy and this investigation actually are. But there does seem to be very strong evidence that Navalny suffered from a multiplicity of pre-existing medical conditions. And it seems to me, based on the information that exists, that death by natural causes cannot be excluded. If you want information about Navalny's conditions, again, the best commentator on this by far is Helmer, who has discussed this many places, in many articles, in his blog, indispensable blog, Dances with Bears, in which he says that I discussed all of this in very great detail. So, without wanting to get too far ahead, it still seems to me that this case is open, but we're starting to see an accumulation of evidence which points away from the theory of an intentional killing. That's one thing I wanted to say. And, well, I have to talk about a certain case in New York. And I'm not going to say very much about it. I'm not going to even identify the defendant because, well, there are well-known sensitivities about this on the part of this platform. But I'm sure that every single person who is watching this video knows whom I'm talking about and knows about the case that I am talking about. There is a scene at the end of Alice in Wonderland where Alice attends a case being tried by the Queen of Hearts, and there's talk about, we proceed first to the sentence and then to the verdict, and she said, this is absurd. Who ever heard of the nonsensical idea of having the sentence, for the sentence first? And I have to say, following this case, I get some of the same feeling. I mean, this is a case in which someone has been found guilty of a crime in which there have been no complaints from any of the victims. The victims, far from having been injured by the defendant, on the contrary, benefited massively from him, mightily from him. They're not unhappy. There was no trial, as far as I can see, on the substantive facts. There was a summary judgment, which again seems to me astonishing. There has been a fine on a gigantic size, which, well, even assuming that some law had indeed been breached, which for all I know it was, some people say that it was, well, given the absence of damage, given the fact, as I said, that on the contrary, the purported victims have been beneficiaries of the defendant's actions, any sort of fine would surely, properly speaking, have been no more than token. This is a fine that runs into the hundreds of millions of dollars. And there are apparently restrictions on the defendant's right to appeal. I've seen claims that he can't even, properly speaking, appeal this decision to the relevant appeal court until he's paid the fine. Now, as I said, none of this makes any kind of sense to me. I read a long piece by Professor Jonathan Turley, in which he basically demolishes this decision. He says it's grotesque. He suggests that the Supreme Court of the United States has jurisdiction and really needs to look at this and set this really extraordinary decision aside. And I have to say I agree. And what makes this judgment so concerning is that, of course, it has happened because of its political context, not, one senses, because of what the defendant actually did, but because of who the defendant is. If he was not the person that he is, it is all but inconceivable that this prosecution would ever have been brought against him, and had it been, that the result of this case would have been what it was. Now, I do hope that the Supreme Court of the United States does set this judgment aside. For the record, I don't think it's going to make any difference to the outcome of the contest for the nomination, for the Republican Party's nomination for the presidential election later this year. I think all it's going to do is win sympathy and support for the defendant. But I will say this: if you are familiar with classical history, as I am, and I've mentioned this point before, you will know that starting from about 140 BC and continuing for about 100 years after, a series of attempts by various political figures to carry out reforms in the Roman Republic met extreme resistance from the governing oligarchy, who used their control of the legal machinery to go after their enemies in what were increasingly bizarre and extreme trials or political and electoral maneuvers. And the result was a political crisis which caused the Republic to collapse into civil wars, ending in a dictatorship established by a man known to history as Caesar Augustus. That, by the way, was not his actual name. But anyway, I don't think it is wrong to compare that situation with the situation in the United States today. After all, so much about the United States is intentionally patterned after Republican Rome. The United States says that it is a republic. That is what the Roman state called itself. The United States, as part of its institutional machinery, has a Senate. That, of course, is a name taken from the presiding body of the Roman Republic. The United States, the location of its parliament. The building that houses its parliament is called the Capitol. And of course, that takes its name from one of the hills in Rome, where some of the main buildings of the Roman Republic were located. And of course, if you want to take the point further, all you have to do is look at the classical architecture, which is so heavily used in Washington, D.C. And of course, that reinforces the similarities, the parallels with Rome even further. Well, as I said, in the Roman Republic, for a long period of time, about 100 years, the courts, the legal system, was increasingly misused as an instrument in factional fighting, with consequences that led eventually to civil war and to the eventual collapse of the Republic and the establishment of a dictatorship. I hope that the United States does not copy its model in that. There is still time, but judgments like this, at a time of increasing partisanship and in the middle of an election season, to put it mildly, don't help. Well, that's my program for today. As I said, a quiet period on the Ukrainian battlefronts. If it persists tomorrow, I hope finally to get back to a discussion in the Middle East, where, by the way, there's now apparently going to be a resumption of hearings in the International Court of Justice, which I will discuss further. But anyway, we will see what happens. This is the end of my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. Don't forget that you can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. You can check out our shop, where there are amazing things, magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, all these great things that you can have. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. It's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.